Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Beth Hendricks. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Colorado, and I'm very pleased you're here for our first book club, at least of 2024, maybe ever.
Hmm.
I am really excited to introduce our guest speaker author, Dr. Kimberly Hamlin. Grew up outside of Syracuse, New York, not far from the historical homes of the many women she writes about today. After graduating from Georgetown University, she worked for women running for office and on Capitol Hill. And after realizing that this was not where change happens, in 2000, Hamlin left Washington to pursue a PhD in American Studies at the University of Texas in Austin to become a professor. In 2007, Hamlin got a job at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, the 10th oldest public university in the country, where she is now the James and Beth Lewis Professor of History, teaching in engaging and provocative ways. She's known for, among other things, the class she created called #MeToo, a cultural history, one of a few classes of its kind in the nation, focusing on women whose voices haven't been shared before, survivors, fighters who make change happen. Hamlin has also written on the origins of the Miss America pageant, the history of the Girl Scouts, bearded ladies, women running for president, Darwin in America, and the Equal Rights Amendment. A regular contributor to the Washington Post's Made by History column and other media, Hamlin speaks to audiences across the country about women's and gender history. She's a member of the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer Bureau. I won't be joining that anytime soon. And the Ohio Humanity Council's Speakers Bureau. Her research on women, gender, science, and politics has been featured in various media outlets, including NPR and CBC Radio, Vice, and QZ.com. She hosts the Mercantile Library's Allgood McLean Women You Should Know series and serves on that library's board. She's also on the board of the League of Women Voters of the United States. And each LWVUS board member serves as a communication liaison to a half a dozen or so states, and Kimberly is Colorado's liaison, which is how I know her and her book. So I'm very pleased to welcome you, Kimberly. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Beth, and thank you for such a thoughtful introduction. My goodness, you really did your homework. Thank you. I appreciate
You
it. I'm really excited to be here on Equal Pay Day during Women's History Month, which I love, hate, which we can talk more about later if you want. And I'm really especially happy to be Colorado's liaison and also Michigan's liaison. Hi, Paula. Um, I think I have the best states to work with, and I really appreciate the chance to talk with you all tonight. So, Beth has prepared a bunch of awesome questions, but I thought I would share a little bit about my research process and what my most recent book was about. It's the book that is responsible for me being on the League of Women Voters National Board. So I had a book come out in 2020 called Free Thinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Remarkable Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner. And it came out on March 17th, 2020. So I had my dream come true book tour planned. I had all my outfits in my suitcase. I was going to go all the places and see all the things. And all my dreams were going to come true. And then I didn't go anywhere for a year like everyone else. And I zoomed up a storm. And so on a Zoom like this, I would always end my book talks by saying something to the effect of, if you want to have your faith in democracy restored, spend some time with the League of Women Voters. And I would provide a little update about voting rights in, at that time, 2020 or 2021. And because my book is about the woman who got the 19th Amendment through Congress. And so one day in, I guess, fall of 21, I got an email that said, "You've been nominated for the National Board of the League of Women Voters." And I said, "Oh my gosh, what a dream. I would love this opportunity. I would love to be able to put my time where my mouth is and to be able to serve in this way. So I think someone who saw one of my 200 Zooms thought that I really like talking about women in voting, which is true. So thank you, whoever nominated me, and I'm really honored to be on the national board. So I'll say a little bit about my book. It's my second book, and I it's the book that I loved so much. I think I will write other books. I hope I will write other books, but I may never love a book as much as I love this one. Beth, I'm looking and I don't see. Oh no, there it is. You did make me co-host. Got it. Thank you. Um, can everyone see my screen okay? Okay. So thank you again, and thank you, Beth, for having me. So this is the cover of the hardback book. The paperback has a different one, but this cover, oh, maybe bonus points. You all might be like the only audience in America that would know what this cover is based on. Any super duper takers on my challenge?
Is well, it seems like it should be Helen, but I mean, it kind of looks like Inez Mulholland as well.
It's the and at the end I can show the actual graphic. It's from a postcard made by an Ohio suffragist. And the postcard says, "Let Ohio women vote." So it's some of the it's based on some of the beautiful artwork. So perfect guess. It's based on some of the artwork that the suffragists made themselves. And this was a 1912 postcard, and I just love the colors, and I thought it was so beautiful. So that is actually not HHG, but so I call her HHG because Helen Hamilton Gardner is a mouthful. So how I came to write this book is in researching my first book, which, as Beth mentioned, was about women and science and Darwin. It was about how 19th century women turned to science to make arguments for equality. So after having grown up being told that women couldn't be equal and couldn't go to school, couldn't be equal in marriage, couldn't vote, couldn't be equal in church because of Eve, I wondered if, in the 1870s and beyond, if women started reading evolution and thinking to themselves, wow, this seems like a different origin story that might have different ramifications for our ideas about the supposed differences between men and women. So I found all of these women who made just that argument and said it's fantastic that we don't have to constantly debate who said what to whom in the Garden of Eden anymore. Now we can turn to science to help us decide what's appropriate for men and women. And Helen Hamilton Gardner was one of my women. She enters the debate in the 1880s when she tries to go to Columbia in New York City, and she is denied because women were not allowed to go to Columbia because the thinking of the day was that their bodies aren't up to the task. First, scientists said that women couldn't go to college and menstruate at the same time. In 1876, pioneering physician Mary Putnam Jacobi disproved that. So then the very same scientist said, well, okay, maybe it's not your periods, your brains are different. Your brains are inferior. And then, in fact, they're inferior to men's in 37 different ways. And Helen Hamilton Gardner picked up her pen and started writing letters to the editor of Popular Science Monthly to dispute the man who had these theories about women's brains. His name was William Hammond, and he was the founding president of the American Neurological Association, and he had been the Surgeon General of the Union Army during the Civil War. So, top dog, head honcho. And I thought, who is Helen Hamilton Gardner and what gave her the chutzpah to write to Popular Science Monthly and take on this leading scientist? And so that's how I met her. And so she became really passionate about disproving these faulty ideas about brain science. And one of her claims was that scientists studied the brains of great men, men who, eminent scholars, statesmen who donated their brains to science to essentially say, look how awesome I am. And why don't you go figure out why? And they compared these brains with the brains of what she called hospital pickups, women who died alone on the streets, anonymous women in hospitals. And so she didn't think there were any differences in brain, but she said, even if there were, we're surely not going to find it by studying these completely disparate types of brains. So she addressed the 1888 International Council of Women, which, as I'm sure you all know, was to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Seneca Falls. And she gave a talk called Sex and Brain. And her main point in delivering this talk was, well, she got invited by her best friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who wanted her to share her research on brains. But she really, what Helen Hamilton Gardner wanted was to convince her friends to donate their brains to science. She said, if we're ever going to be able to disprove these theories, we're going to need to provide the brains of educated women. So she got Elizabeth Cady Stanton to agree. But when Stanton died, her children said, "Oh my gosh, this is bonkers." And they called her Heathen Helen, and they said, "We cannot give mom's brain for Heathen Helen's statistics." So when Heathen Helen died, this is exactly what you think it is. She donated her brain to the Burt Wilder Brain Collection at Cornell, which was at the time the largest brain collection. This was a thing that people did in the 19th and early 20th century. So she donated her brain to prove once and for all the intellectual equality of women. This was covered across the country. Her brain bequest, women wills brain, brain removed, brain on route. And finally, the New York Times declared her brain not inferior to men's. So I thought, gosh, I really want to know more about this woman. So the more I delved into her, the more I found her brain science work was actually the least interesting thing she did. She led a fascinating life, and through her, we can really see the whole of the 19th century women's rights movement that culminates in the 19th Amendment. So, what landed her in New York City in 1888 was not just her desire for education, but it was a sex scandal. So, who was Helen Hamilton Gardner? Well, she was really named Alice Chenoweth. That was her birth name. She was born to a first family of Virginia, a slave-owning family in Virginia in 1853. But her father was a Methodist minister who couldn't reconcile his religious beliefs with slave owning. So when she was a baby, he moved everyone first to DC, and then to Indiana, where she grew up. And then she became a teacher. Her family lost everything during the Civil War. Her brothers fought for the Union, as did her father. And so she became a teacher, which was like the only job a middle class white woman could have to support herself in the 1860s and 70s. But when she was the youngest principal in Ohio, she came to the attention of the Ohio Commissioner of Schools, an elected official who was much older than she was and who told her that he was divorced, except for that he was totally not divorced. So they had an affair and it made it into all the papers. And what I really appreciated about her is that she didn't slink away in shame, which was kind of the standard narrative, but she moved to New York City, changed her name to Helen Hamilton Gardner, reinvented to become one of the most well-published. She wrote 7 books and countless articles and essays, and most sought after speakers on the lecture circuit, never revealing to anyone her true story. And the issue that she really started to tackle in her writing and speaking was the sexual double standard. And so knowing that she had her own, experience as a fallen woman helped me understand her perspective on this. And then in 1910, she moved to Washington, D.C. to become the suffragist lead negotiator to Congress and especially to President Wilson. And when she died in 1925, she was the highest ranking woman in federal government. So I had the best time researching this book. I went to all the places she lived. This is the house she lived when she was a principal in Ohio, in Sandusky. These are the people who live there now. They gave me a tour. Their house is on the National Register of Historic Places, so it hadn't been changed much. And what I learned there is how exactly she was outed. So this was a widow's boarding house that Alice Chenoweth, as she was known at the time, lived while she was a teacher and a principal. And the other boarders at this house were newlyweds, and the newlyweds were the brother and sister-in-law of the guy who published and edited the Sandusky, Ohio daily paper. So there was like a express train from the comings and goings of Alice Chenoweth to the daily paper. So this was an unfortunate piece of happenstance for her. And so she was eventually outed in the papers for this affair, and some even ran her name, which is why she changed her name. I also went and visited where she lived for many years in New York City, which was her favorite place that she lived. She always considered herself a New Yorker. And I want to show one other house. And this was where she lived in DC. And here she is, it's 1838 Lamont Street, not too far from the zoo. And and so you can hear the animals from her back porches. And what I wanted to show about this is how her house again really influenced her trajectory. So her next door neighbor in this house was a guy named Champ Clark. Champ Clark, if you've read the book, you'll know was the Speaker of the House of Representatives and a popular Democrat who had challenged Woodrow Wilson for the presidential nomination in 1912. And so, because of her proximity to Champ Clark, and because by this point she was married to a guy who had been a Civil War hero and career Army sergeant, she had a Rolodex full of DC insiders. Because if you think about who's in power in DC in the 1910s, it's all the Civil War heroes' sons and nephews. So she had an easy access to all of these people, which Nassau really coveted. They hadn't had such insider access before. And Helen Hamilton Gardner was so smart and she used this porch so well. She would do things like make muffins or cookies, and she would wait inside her door and listen for the click of Champ Clark's door so she'd know he was going out. And then she would say, oh, hello, Champ Clark. Would you like my peach muffins? And he would say, sure. And she would say, okay, great. How is our amendment coming along? Is it through the Rules Committee yet? So she was a really brilliant negotiator. So I can show you more pictures later, but I wanted to show the ones from my research because they are not in the book, and I thought that would be fun to see. So Beth, I know you have some questions. I don't know if others have questions or if you want me to talk more about the main points. As a
I
professor, I usually assume
this
that
is
students haven't done the reading. So I'm prepared to talk as if you haven't done the reading, but I don't want to bore you if you have like more specific questions. So
no, I think this is fantastic, but if you're okay with it, if people can ask
yeah,
questions as you're going along, just raise your hands, folks. And oh,
yes,
Celeste.
yeah.
Thanks for the book. It was great. And I'm actually in a Women of the West and
Oh,
Beyond book group. And maybe I'll recommend this for next year when we
oh,
get,
great.
do suggestions. Yeah, this was, I had never heard of this person. One of the books that the National League read was A Woman's Hour by Elaine
Yeah.
Rice.
Uh-huh.
And I just looked up in the index and Helen Gardner's mentioned a couple of times and
I know.
but not a lot. But so and Helen Gardner is such a standard name that it doesn't stand out, even though
Yeah.
like Elizabeth Cady Stanton is one of my favorites ever. And that her really good friend was Helen Gardner, I didn't know. So that was um um one of the things that struck me that I learned about in the book was the power of Black women. Like this whole fight over not letting, I read the Woman's Hour is all about the last
Yep.
state, Tennessee,
Yep.
getting, giving women suffrage, and the whole question of Black women came up, but it didn't. I felt like your book really hit it on the head, that um, saying that the white men were afraid of the Black women, basically. That
Yeah.
was so impressive to me. So anyway, I wanted to thank you for that. And what I have a friend who grew up in Cicero, New York. You're
Oh,
not
yeah.
from there.
That's not far.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm from a suburb of Syracuse called Camillus, which is not at
Okay.
all far from Cicero.
Okay.
So, I mean, you have that. I'm so glad that you got that as a main theme because that was one of like the top two main themes I wanted to get across. The other was about sex and the sexual double standard. Um, but the theme of race, I that was a real eye opener to me. And maybe I'll return to my sharing screen and I'll show you some of the letters because what I did, there hadn't been a lot of previous. So, how archives work is each group saves their own papers. So, like Alice Paul's National Women's Party saves their papers. Helen Hamilton Gardner's, our predecessors, Nassau saves their papers. So there's not a ton of like what everyone said back and forth all the time. So there hadn't, so people, when they go to tell the suffrage story, they had mostly looked at the suffrage group's papers. And I wondered, well, what are the suffragists saying to the members of Congress? You know, sometimes there'll be like one half of it in the Nassau papers or the NWP papers, but like, what were the congressmen saying? So because HHG was the main negotiator to Congress, I spent a lot of time at Library of Congress first going through the Woodrow Wilson papers, which PS have so much Helen Hamilton Gardner stuff. She, after his two wives and daughter, she is the #1 most referenced woman in the entire Woodrow Wilson collection. That is how much they corresponded. Now, you would not know that from his finding aid, which was organized like 50 years ago by old white men who didn't think suffrage like merited a call out as an important topic in his collection. But when you look by name, you see. So anyway, so I was thinking to myself, you know, some of HHG's friends in Congress, I knew their names. So I had a somewhat of a list, or I could tell like what she was telling Maud Wood Parker, Carrie Chapman Catt. Oh, I'm going to go to so and so's office. So I kind of kept a list of like her top 5 most frequently contacted senators, because you know the 19th Amendment passed pretty easily in the House. So all the debate was in the Senate. So I focused on who was she trying to lobby in the Senate. And her best friend in the Senate, closest friend, was the senator from Mississippi, John Sharp Williams. So let me share my screen again, and I'll show you some of the letters that I found between them that really surprised me. So in 1918, after the House passed the amendment, suffragists hoped it would be easy to get it through the Senate. They were completely wrong. It was almost impossible. And so they thought this is a letter that HHG wrote to her friend John Sharp Williams just days after the House passes the 19th Amendment. And she thinks, okay, we need a couple Southern senators to get our 2/3 majority in the Senate. I'm going to start with this guy because he's my friend. And because he also was known to be really erudite, he had a big library, they exchanged books. So she thought, of all the Southern Democrats, I have a chance with the one who reads books. So she writes him this letter and she lays it on thick. She says, as you can see, like, you know, of all the Southern states in the House that voted, only Mississippi was the one who voted against it. I want you to redeem your state. You are by far its leading citizen. She goes on to talk about his grandchildren and his children, and, you know, to say basically, you know, this is coming. You know, women are going to be voting. Why not just do the right thing so that you can really be a beacon, you know, of leadership, and your legacy will stand. He writes her right back the next day, and he says, you know, Helen, if anything could get me to do the thing you want, it would be your letter. And he said, but I will never vote to enfranchise Black women in the South. And he said, first of all, as you can see up at the top, he said, the 19th Amendment is just another reiteration of the 15th Amendment, which all the Southern senators and some of the other senators hated. And he said, you know, I don't want to have another federal amendment about voting rights. And he said, I'm afraid that if we have the 19th Amendment, not only will Black women go to the polls while white women stay home, you can see that here. At the bottom, he said, we won't be able to stop them. He said, if you know, as you know, the real reason why Black men in the state of Mississippi don't vote is not because of the various fake legal ways we've disqualified them, but because they are afraid if they do go, some of them might get hurt. And that's what he's saying at the very bottom. And he goes on to say, but, you know, Black women are women after all. So I guess, you know, we couldn't use violence against them to keep them from the polls. So I thought, wow, here it is. Here is the main objection to women voting. And this really stood out to me also in the Senate debates, on the floor of the Senate that happened multiple times throughout 1918. Like, if you had been a fly on the wall, you would have been wondering, like, what amendment are we talking about? Because they mostly talked about the 15th Amendment and how much they hated it, and how they didn't want the federal government to enforce it because they were afraid not only would Black women go to the polls, but if it were enforced, Black men would go too. So by the 19 teens, all the other like old objections about women voting had basically fallen by the wayside. There were enough women professionals, enough women who had gone to college. You couldn't say women aren't smart enough. You know, there were enough women activists that you couldn't say women having their own interests or political ideas will destroy the family. I mean, some people did say that, but you couldn't, like, that wasn't an argument you could really uphold anymore. So the main sticking point was Black women voting in the South. And that to me was a real, the main takeaway of my research. So thank you for that question. That's a really good point. I see
We do
Jill.
have a great.
Kimberly, so I was very happy to have a book about a suffragist I didn't know about. But when we study the history of suffrage, it's about the American Woman Suffrage
Yep.
Association, national. And Helen did not associate herself with either of those groups or with the combined group with NASA. And that seemed odd to me. Can you talk a little more
Yeah,
about her connections and why she didn't decide to be a real association player?
sure. So she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the 1880s on the free thought lecture circuit. And that was her initial connection. And so at that point, you know, Stanton was ousted more or less from the movement after she published the Women's Bible. So she was kind of on the outs. And so Helen Hamilton Gardner was on the outs too, along and like in alliance with her best friend Stanton. And so partly it was like a personal reason, but also ideologically, she was a radical, especially in the 1890s. She was talking about sex. She was talking about the sexual double standard. She was talking about atheism, things that Nassau was not. That's why they had censored Stanton. You know, they did not want to be talking about that. But once she married the Civil War hero in 1902, they traveled the world for 7 years. And she came back and they settled ultimately as kind of a compromise in Washington, D.C. in 1910. And I think she was kind of lost. You know, when she left, she had been one of the most well-known women in America, a frequent lecturer, drawing crowds, publishing books and essays. And when she came back, everyone had kind of forgotten about her. And I think she didn't know what to do. And so she looked around and said, well, I am living next door to the Speaker of the House. And so within a few months, NASA had listed her as their most valuable Washington, D.C. volunteer. And then in 1913, for the first thing she really did for NASA was co-organize with Alice Paul the suffrage procession to coincide with Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. So from that point on, she was like really the most important woman in Washington for NASA. And she became a NASA vice president, and she was co-chair of the NASA Congressional Committee for many years under Maud Wood Park. And even Carrie Chapman Catt wouldn't go or contact the White House without Helen Hamilton Gardner. So she was slow to come to Nassau, but that is how and when she got there.
Did she have connections to the National Women's Party?
She did. So Alice Paul, when Alice Paul decided when she got the permission from Nassau to organize the parade in December of 1912, the first woman she reached out to was Helen Hamilton Gardner. And she said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to need a DC insider. And so she had known Alice Paul from the beginning. They worked side by side. I have a picture in the book and on my PowerPoint of them in the Nassau Parade headquarters. They worked night and day. Alice Paul said, no one is here as much as Helen Hamilton Gardner. She did all the press for it. She did all the permissions. She's the reason the parade went down Pennsylvania Avenue instead of 16th Street, which is what the officials at first were insisting they do. But then they started to hate each other and they became frenemies, and really just basically enemies. And so their disdain for each other plays a huge role in why Alice Paul split from Nassau. So after the parade, Alice Paul starts saying, well, gosh, I just want to protest all the time now. Like that seemed to work. Let's double down on protesting. And in fact, I'm going to protest all the Democrats in the 1914 election. And Helen Hamilton Gardner was like, whoa, whoa, we're nonpartisan. We at Nassau are nonpartisan. I'm sorry, I have a cold. And she was like, Champ Clark is my next door neighbor. He's the Speaker of the House. Like, am I supposed to campaign against him? Like, he is helping us. This is not going to go well if we decide, to just protest the people in power all the time. And then their first main legislative priority was to establish a women's suffrage committee in the House, which was a procedural move they needed to get the 19th Amendment out of committee onto the House floor, ultimately for a vote. And so whenever Helen Hamilton Gardner thought she had the votes all lined up to get the committee, Alice Paul would stage a protest and she would say all these things. And then Helen Hamilton Gardner would go call her friends in the House and they would say, well, we can't give you your committee now. You guys have been trash talking us all over the newspapers. And she was like, oh my God, it's not me, it's Alice Paul. And so they became enemies. And then Alice Paul was like negotiating with Nassau that year, 1914. Would she come back? Would she not come back? And she had said, well, I won't be on the congressional committee if Helen Hamilton Gardner is on it. And then she got a visual of like a leaked press release that said Helen Hamilton Gardner was going to be on the congressional committee. So that's when Alice Paul said, kick rocks, Nassau, I'm going to do my own thing.
Thank you.
Jill?
Yes, thank you. I too just really enjoyed reading this book about someone that I did not know about, and yet something that I just felt all throughout the book was how she worked so hard for her own personal autonomy.
Yes.
And how everything that she did was to protect herself. And I thought that that gave such strength to what she was doing. And, you know, you're talking about her diplomacy, you know,
Yeah.
she knew that her strength could help rather than, you know, just being against something. And I really like that as well. But then at the end of the book, it said that in her will, she directed her nieces to burn unopened my letters, and personal papers. So all of that, even, is this part of her personal autonomy that she didn't want other people to be, you know, exposed to or you know, I don't know, threatened by or whatever? Do you think that that was her thinking about that? And then I guess you had so many public papers that you could write the book about her. But man, to miss out on all of her
I
personal,
know.
I just thought that that was a
I
real
know.
loss.
And then she
Thank
lists
you.
them. She's like, oh, they're in the cabinet. Oh, they're under
Yes,
the sink. Oh, they're in the, I'm like, oh my
yes,
God, how many papers did you burn? What
that's right.
gems were in there?
I
I
know.
mean, so I think that she decided to burn her papers because she didn't want anyone to know the truth about her relationship with Charles Smart, that it had been an affair and that they
That's
were never
true.
married, because she had so carefully cultivated her reputation. And I think she was so happy when she got the post at the Civil Service Commission. I mean,
Yes.
those are her happiest years. And she was so proud of herself and she felt like she did it. You know what I mean? It was the first time in her life that she had a regular paycheck. As you mentioned, she had always supported herself. But after she got fired from her principal job, it was, you know, kind of hand to mouth. This lecture, this essay, it wasn't a regular paycheck. And both of her husbands, the fake one and the real one, were not good at money. So she felt, you know, a lot of pressure. So I think she loved the money of it. She loved having the house to herself because by that point the real husband had died, which she wasn't too broken up about, PS. Um, so I think it was she didn't want her carefully crafted image to be
Image.
ruined, because I think the sexual double standard is patriarchy's last best tool. And even though she had critiqued it and fought for other fallen women, she didn't want to be classed with them.
That's a good explanation. Thank you.
And I
Yeah,
think that
thank
maybe
you.
the
And
first
she
husband
was
had
also the
privilege.
highest paid woman
Yes.
in
Yep.
government. My
Yep.
gosh,
She
her
loved it.
salary in what,
Yep.
1918 or whenever it was
Yep.
what I got in 1968 when I became a teacher. I thought, wow.
Yep.
She was
And she had
paid.
a car with a
Wow.
driver at her disposal. I mean,
Yes,
she loved it.
yes, that's right. Well, thank you for that explanation. I
Yeah.
understand.
I mean, I don't
And I
know. I mean,
loved
who knows what those papers would have said?
I love that she got the job while she was advocating for other people to get the job, you
Yeah.
know, that was great.
And now but I also don't know, like, how hard was she advocating for the other people? You know what I mean? She was pretty savvy, so I appreciate your generous view of her. She may also have had a pretty good idea of how it was gonna shake out, although I don't know.
Yeah.
Hi, Linda.
I'm very happy to meet you tonight because I had suggested this book for our Larimer County League's
Oh,
Informed Citizen Book Club. We read it 1 year ago
oh
for
my
Women's
gosh.
History Month.
Oh, thank you.
And we had a great discussion at that time. And I think one of the things that came out of that, one of the questions that I asked was, what did you learn? What were you surprised at? One of the things that people said, well, now I'm really interested to read more about women's history,
Oh,
that
yay.
this sparked, like, and particularly after her relationship trying to influence Wilson,
Yep,
like, who were the other women that talked to their presidents or their speakers'
yeah,
ears? And how can we uncover those stories? Because it was not something that's written into history. It's like
I
you got to
know.
go dig
You have to
to
d
find this. So I'm wondering, did you have other in your work on this, did you find other women that you thought were particularly appealing, that just kind of looked like the demure woman, but really had power, that they were
um,
strategizing and really working to
so,
influence?
yes, so that there's so many, I feel like, questions in there, and thank you for suggesting my
Yeah.
book for your book club too. Um, so, I mean, when I wrote my book proposal for this, I said at the end that what my goal is for people to read this book and say, "I can't believe I've never heard of Helen Hamilton Gardner. Who else have I never heard of?" And it sounds like that was the sensation you had, right? Because there are so many amazing women, and I've alluded to some of the ways that women get written out of history, like when I was talking about, how she was kind of obscured in the Woodrow Wilson archives and even in the senators' papers. I didn't get too into the weeds on that, but that's a whole other story of like finding the suffrage correspondence in the senators' papers. The pro-suffrage senators tended to have a subject file named suffrage, so you could go look and pull that file. The ones who were anti, or most senators did not. So then I had to go look at the calendar and see when were they voting on the 19th Amendment, like what were the dates, and get the chronological correspondence files, like in the 2 weeks lead up, and then see, okay, who was writing about suffrage. So they are in there. The other woman who actually does have a biography written about her, but I was really intrigued by and hope to write more about, is Mabel Walker Willenbrand. So she, after HHG died, Mabel Walker Willenbrand was the highest ranking woman in federal government, and she was appointed Assistant U.S. Attorney General to enforce prohibition. But she loved this super high ranking job, but she was not a prohibitionist. She had not been a temperance advocate. She came from California, where she had advocated on behalf of women who were arrested for prostitution, and she advocated that the men should be the ones punished. So I really like her. And she has a great collection also at Library of Congress. She never married. She ended up adopting a daughter later in life. Um, but she is a really interesting woman too. And so she rose to through the ranks kind of from her charm and her kind of like HHG. Um, and ultimately went and became a big time Hollywood lawyer. So she has an interesting trajectory. The other woman I think more could be said about is Maud Wood Park. Um, and Maud Wood Park, obviously the founding president of League of Women Voters, but she and HHG worked so well together when Maud Wood Park took control of the Congressional Committee of Nassau in 1917. And they really became close friends. And Maud Wood Park, also had a secret husband who was not great. And that's why he was a secret. So I think I kind of feel like HHG told Maud Wood Park the truth, and that they kind of bonded over the things that women endure and survive. I don't know. I have no evidence of this, but they were really simpatico in that way. Um, and I also love Maud Wood Park so much because she donated, she did so much at the end of her life to collect and compile the histories of the women, and she was desperate also to record HHG's story, and she kept nominating for awards and reaching out to people trying to get a biography written, none of which came to pass. But Maudwood Park is whose collection started what is now the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women at Harvard, which is the nation's biggest repository of women. And that came from your founding president, Maudwood Park. So I feel like she's another one. While people do know her name, there is a lot more that could be said about her.
And
I did
just-
not know her name. I always thought Carrie Chapman Catt was
She
the first.
she was the president of Nassau when 19th Amendment got ratified, but Maudwood Park
Okay,
was her like number 2, and then she became the number 1 of League of Women Voters.
so what was secret about her husband that he was married to somebody else? He wasn't? I
No.
mean, what
They lived in a
she
different,
just-
I think it was that they didn't want to be married anymore, but it was too scandalous to be divorced.
Oh,
So she had a husband that lived in another state and that she did not speak of or acknowledge, I think.
was his name Park?
That I cannot remember.
Okay.
I mean, you could get away with a lot of things before Google. You know,
And wasn't Maud quite a bit younger
she
than
was.
Ellen?
Yep. She had
How
come
many,
up
how
through the,
many years was it?
oh my gosh, someone Google. What, well,
15, 20?
No,
Not
no.
20.
more like 30, I think. Maudwood Park had come up through the ranks by being president of the College Equal Suffrage Association. So she was in college, like in the early 1900s when HHG was
Oh, yeah,
already 60.
sure. Yeah. Oh, about 30 years
I
younger.
think.
Wow.
I
Okay.
can Google when was Maudwood Park born, but HHG was 53.
Check
Maud.
and see when she died then too, because if she did all of that after Helen, that's great.
She was born, Maudwood Park was born in 71. So okay, they're not quite 20 years difference. And she died in
Okay.
55.
Wow.
1955.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Do you want to see the letter
Ooh.
that convinced me I wanted to write this book?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. So for years I was like, can you see that? Oh wait, hold on. I need to not be sharing so I can scroll back. 1 second. So for years I would just like whenever I was on a research trip, I would, look up Helen Hamilton Gardner, was that where I was, and try to see like, is there enough for a book? Is there enough for a book? What else can I find? And this was the letter when I thought, oh, I'm definitely going to write this book. So there's the sculptor of suffrage, Adelaide Johnson. Have you ever heard of her? She's the one who sculpted that bust of Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony that's at the Capitol. And so she has this great collection at the Library of Congress because she wanted to create a museum of all the women. And so they would come sit and have their busts sculpted, and and Adelaide Johnson would take these detailed notes about their conversations. And she was super gossipy and a little bit cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. So she would write all sorts of things in her notes about the women. So I was going through the Adelaide Johnson collection, just seeing what I could find like for days and thinking this is a giant waste of my time. But then I came across this letter and I recognized that handwriting and I thought, oh, this is from HHG. And it says, my dear little Phil. And then at the end, she signs it little one. And I thought, oh, that makes sense because she was 5'2" and like barely 100 pounds. So she was known for being very little. And if you go like this with your head, do you see what she underlines? Best destroy this letter. So this was the letter buried in the Adelaide Johnson collection. It's 3 pages long, single space typewritten, where she goes through the whole thing about Charles Smart, how he lied to her, how he like basically took all her money, how she had to put him in a sanitarium because he was dying and losing his marbles, probably because of syphilis, and how while he was in this sanitarium, she came across the letter in his deathbed pocket from his daughter, which let her know that he had been keeping in touch with his family the whole entire time. And so this was like a revelatory letter for me. I mean, it really showed me what she was thinking, what she had gone through, and how this shaped her. So if it weren't for this, I don't know that I could have written the book or written it the way that I did.
Who's little
So-
Phil?
Oh, good question. So little Phil is a woman named Mary Phillips, and she lived in New York City, and she had a boarding house that many of the suffragists, or I don't know if it was a boarding house, but like a big house that suffragists would stay in when they passed through town. And so, including HHG. And so she was one of HHG's best friends, and she was kind of like a fixer, um, Mary Phillips. And she also had Adelaide Johnson stay at her house a lot of times when Adelaide Johnson, the sculptor, was passing through. So I'm thinking Adelaide Johnson, who was a little bit drama queen and had a lot of feuds with people, I think she just saw these letters and took them. Because there's more. Because the other question is, why the heck does Adelaide Johnson have these letters, which are neither to her or from her? And I think she just took them from when she was staying at Mary Phillips's house, because the other letters in this collection are all about when Charles Smart died, and the real wife threatens to come to New York and go to probate court and say, I'm the wife and I'm the executor of the will. And Mary Phillips is the one that HHG delegated to be the go-between with the lawyer and the real wife, and to try to keep it all hush hush.
Any
So,
idea how this letter ended up in Puerto Rico?
oh, so Helen Hamilton Gardner was in Puerto Rico with the guy that would soon be her husband. So Charles Smart, the fake husband, dies in January 1901. By August, she's already in Puerto Rico with
Okay.
Selden Allen Day, who in 1902 becomes her husband. So I think she already had like a pretty solidly worked out exit strategy. If you think about how fast, between when the one died and when she's on her way to Puerto Rico.
Well, that guy was a drag.
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't know that she did not love him like she loved Charles Smart. Like she only has one diary that survived, and it's at the Schlesinger in that collection that Maud Wood Park started. And in that one diary, it's from 1907 when they're in Paris. And she's like so lonely and so bored. And all he wants to do is fiddle with his car, his automobile, and drive around Europe. And she even writes that he forgot her birthday. And then um, she said Charles Smart, she said CSS, Charles Selden Smart, underlined, never forgot my birthday.
Yeah, I was surprised she didn't dump that guy earlier, but I guess that would have been complicated.
Yeah, I think so. I think she needed him for cover. She needed a husband so she could travel about the country saying radical things.
Mhm.
I
So yes.
remember there was a place in your book where you said this was the end of their
Oh
relationship,
yeah.
being Charles Smart and
Yeah.
Alice Chenoweth or whatever, HHD,
Yeah.
whoever she was at that point, because if something had happened, I'm forgetting what it was, but it was before he died.
Yep.
Um,
It was 1893. So she goes to Chicago, to the World's Fair in Chicago, where she delivers more
oh,
speeches than any other American woman, where the newspapers report, there were lines out the door, people were bribing the policemen to get in. And she goes home and she realizes that Charles Smart has lied. Like he said he went out of town, but she knew he was lying about where he went. And so she doesn't know exactly what he did. She figures it out like 9 years later when he dies, and she finds the letter that he must have gone to West Virginia to visit his family. All she knew at that time was that he had lied. And I also think that he had syphilis.
you said something like he was no longer her husband, she was more like his mother or something like
She wrote
that.
that in that letter
Yeah,
that she wrote to little
yeah,
Phil. Yep, that's
yeah,
exactly how she described it. After that point, she said, I was no longer his wife.
yeah.
Yep. But she supported him. I mean, he was bringing in no money,
And he never forgot her birthday.
but he never forgot her birthday.
She completely supported him.
Yep.
How did she not get syphilis?
I mean, maybe she did,
Uh,
or
mhm.
well, actually, I mean, if she did, I don't think she would have donated her brain to science
Good point.
unless it wasn't, unless it didn't develop as much. But I think she may have been lucky in that he may have gotten it and she may have figured it out early on enough to, cease marital relations. But that was another takeaway message of my research is how widespread syphilis was in the 19th century. It was more prevalent than all other infectious diseases combined. So that also shifted my view of women's rights. Like I think that's what got a lot of women to go to meetings, be it temperance meetings or suffrage meetings. I don't, they didn't necessarily say that out loud, but I think, you know, when you can't say no to your husband, you can't get divorced, you're looking for something you can do.
But that would also make you not want to, I mean, the subtitle of the book says sex in it,
Yeah.
you know, and you wouldn't want to have free sex, free
Yeah.
love if in that sort of
Yeah.
situation. So
And most didn't. I mean, the sex is the affair, but she
Mhm.
was not a free lover. And this is why, like, I think a lot of my students, you know, when we talk about the 19th century feminists, they are confused as to like why they weren't more talking about like women's right to have sex or women's right to enjoy sex outside of marriage. And I'm like, you cannot even imagine how awful that would have seemed to them. Like, they were very likely to die in pregnancy. If they didn't die, their sister died. They watched half of their babies die, and everyone had syphilis. Like, they weren't remotely thinking, what I really want to do is have a lot more sex. I mean, they were not. That was hard to, you know, that was really hard to imagine at that point.
So the subtitle of your book it actually means reinvention.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, that's how I think of HHG. She reinvented herself multiple times. It
Yeah.
was like reading stories
Yes.
about different people.
Yep. She was so savvy and a survivor, really. I think that's a really interesting way to think of it, Celeste. Hi, Mary.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to comment on part of the book that I was really struck by was her fight against the sexual double standard,
Yeah,
and yet we still have it.
you know.
And I was just struck. I was like, I really had no idea that any women were outspoken enough to even talk about that so long ago. And yet it still really persists in all the ways that she argued about.
I know.
Yep, just
Yeah,
ask Taylor Swift.
I know.
Mhm.
It is. I mean, I think she would be appalled to see how much we are still in the grips of the sexual double standard, to be honest. And I
It
think, you know,
seems,
she was more like forthright in talking about it. But many women did. I mean, now I see the temperance movement in a whole new light too, because I think that's basically what they were talking about. Not just having their husbands spend their money at their bars, but also they didn't want to have their drunk husbands come home and sexually assault them and get syphilis, you know? So they didn't talk about women's right to enjoy free love. They talked about women's right to say no.
and I guess her optimism that, if only we could get the vote,
Yeah,
then all this will go away.
I know.
And
Yeah,
so, I was puzzling like, okay, now what? Because
yeah,
that didn't really work that way.
yeah, I know.
But
It's a bigger change, right?
Still working on that.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
But her other thing was
Okay.
financial autonomy, which I think I think it was Celeste, or maybe Lydia was saying about, it was Jill, that she really wanted to be autonomous. And I think that's the other piece of the puzzle, right? She wanted to be financially autonomous and she wanted to hold her professional destiny, all of it in her hands. Margie?
Okay, Margie, last question.
Yeah, yes, I wanted to say that I haven't finished the book, but I have been enjoying it, and I read a lot of nonfiction and biographies, and I'm just really impressed with your research. And I'm a former history teacher, so I'm
Oh,
really, I'm really, and I'm the themes in it, and I'm just wondering why I never heard of her before. I mean, I taught history and women's
yeah.
history, and it's like, well, I never even heard of this lady, so I'm glad you brought her to us. And I'm going to be recommending it for my book club too, because I just think
Oh,
it's so well written, and it's fun
thank
to
you.
read, and it's just so different, and it's just like you just painted her where I think really visualize her. She's not the stoic Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the white, black and white photos and things like that that I saw in my history books all those
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
So anyway, but thank you. I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed
Thank
your
you.
conversation today. It was very helpful. I'm going to finish the book.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Kimberly.
Oh my
Really
gosh, thank you so
appreciate
much
your
for having me.
time.
It's an honor to meet you all. maybe I'll see some or all of you at convention.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Hey.
I know
Thanks, Beth.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank
Beth,
you.
for
Great.
Thanks.
starting this up.
Yes, thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Take care.
Thank
Thank you.
Bye.
Really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Bye.
Everybody take
Bye-bye.
care. Good night.